Sometimes the smallest person carries the biggest heart. In Cedar Ridge, folks measured a man's worth by height. When 5-foot-tall Jake Wheeler dared approach Thunder, the wild Mustang that had thrown every cowboy in 3 counties, townspeople, gathered to watch what they expected would be another failure. Thunder was no ordinary horse. He was a legend of fury, untamed by rope or will. For months this beast had been talk of every saloon. Strong men twice Jake's size had tried and failed. Each attempt ended in dust and wounded pride. But Jake saw something different in those wild eyes. A kindred spirit who understood being underestimated. What happened when these unlikely souls met would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory, where the scent of sage and leather mingled with the promise of another sweltering day. Jake Wheeler stood barely 5 feet in his worn boots, watching the commotion from the steps of Murphy's General Store. His weathered hands, small but calloused from years of honest work, gripped a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 38, Jake had learned to navigate a world built for bigger men. His slight frame often fooled strangers into thinking him younger, but his eyes, deep brown and patient as creek stones, held the wisdom of someone who'd faced life's harder lessons early. His hair, once the color of wheat, now showed silver at the temples, and his face bore the quiet lines of a man who'd spent more time listening than talking. The crowd gathering in the street buzzed with excitement and cruel anticipation. Word had spread through town like wildfire that Jake Wheeler, Little Jake, as some called him behind his back, intended to try his luck with Thunder. The very notion seemed to amuse most folks, though Jake noticed a few older residents shaking, their heads with something closer to concern than mockery. "You sure about this, Jake?" came a familiar voice from behind him. Jake turned to find Martha Hendricks, the store owner's widow, standing in the doorway. At 62, Martha was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who'd known Jake since he'd arrived 15 years ago, a broken young man, carrying nothing but a battered satchel and the weight of unspoken grief. She'd given him his first job sweeping her store floors, never once commenting on his size or asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Been thinking about it for months, Martha," Jake replied, his voice steady but soft. "Man can't spend his whole life wondering what might have been." Martha's expression softened. She'd watched Jake grow from a lost soul into one of the most reliable men in town. He'd fixed wagon wheels for families who couldn't pay, sat with sick children when their parents needed rest, and never once raised his voice in anger, even when others tested his patience. She knew there was steel beneath his gentle exterior, forged by experiences he'd never shared. "That Mustang's different, Jake. He's not just wild, he's angry. Been that way since they brought him in from the desert 3 months ago." Jake nodded, understanding more than he revealed. He'd been watching Thunder from a distance, studying the magnificent stallion's movements, his reactions, the way he carried himself like a king stripped of his kingdom. The horse stood 16 hands high, his coat the color of storm clouds, with a mane that flowed like black silk when he moved. But it was Thunder's eyes that haunted Jake. Wild, yes, but filled with a fury that spoke of betrayal and loss. "He's got reason to be angry," Jake said quietly, setting his cup on the weathered railing. "Sometimes anger's just pain wearing a different coat." The wisdom in those words made Martha study Jake's profile more closely. Even after all these years, she sensed depths in this man that he kept carefully hidden. She'd long suspected his past held more than the simple drifter's story he'd offered when he first arrived, but she respected his privacy. In a town where gossip spread faster than summer lightning, Jake Wheeler had earned a reputation for keeping his own counsel and never speaking ill of others. Down the street, the crowd was growing larger. Jake recognized most of the faces. Sam Morrison, the barrel-chested blacksmith who'd laughed loudest when Jake first mentioned his intention to approach Thunder. Pete Garrison and his two sons, who ran the local ranch and considered themselves the authority on all matters equine. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, one of the few women in town who commanded respect in her own right, her medical bag never far from her side. And Mayor Thomas Caldwell, a politician who measured everything by how it might affect his standing come election time. But it was the figure leaning against the saloon's support beam that drew Jake's attention. Ethan Cross stood with casual arrogance, his expensive hat tilted at just the right angle, his silver belt buckle catching the morning light. Cross owned the largest spread in the territory and had made it clear he considered Thunder a prize worth claiming. The man had tried twice to break the stallion, employing methods that bordered on cruel, and both times Thunder had sent him and his hired hands scrambling for safety. "Cross is watching you," Martha observed, following Jake's gaze. "Figured he would be. He's not happy about you making this attempt. Sees it as questioning his authority, I suppose." Jake turned back to Martha, offering her a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Martha, I've spent my whole life being underestimated. Man gets used to it after a while. Sometimes it even works in his favor." Martha returned his smile, but worry still creased her brow. "Your father's spurs are showing," she said softly, nodding toward Jake's boots. Jake glanced down at the silver spurs that had belonged to his father, the only possessions of value he'd carried when he arrived in Cedar Ridge. They were elegant, the things crafted by a master silversmith, engraved with designs that spoke of Mexican heritage and passed down through generations. Jake rarely wore them, keeping them wrapped in soft cloth in his small room above the livery stable, but today felt different. Today he needed their weight against his heels, their whispered reminder of who he'd been before the world tried to make him smaller. "He would have liked Thunder," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of old sadness. "Papa always said the wildest horses had the biggest hearts. You just had to find the key that unlocked their trust." "Your father was a horseman?" Jake nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "Best I ever knew. Could gentle the meanest bronc without breaking their spirit. Said there was a difference between taming and breaking, and a real horseman never confused the two." This was more about his past than Jake had ever revealed, and Martha felt the privilege of his trust. She'd known, somehow, that there was breeding and education behind Jake's quiet dignity, a refinement that couldn't be entirely hidden, despite his humble circumstances. "What happened to him?" Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Same thing that happens to a lot of good men. The world took more from him than he could give." Before Martha could respond, a commotion erupted from the street. Thunder had been brought out of the makeshift corral they'd built behind the saloon, and the sight of the magnificent stallion sent a murmur through the crowd. Even from a distance, Jake could feel the horse's power, the barely contained fury that rippled through his muscled frame. 3 men held lead ropes attached to a halter, but Thunder was clearly tolerating their presence rather than accepting. His hooves struck the packed earth with the rhythm of war drums, and his eyes swept the crowd with undisguised contempt. This was no broken creature. This was a king forced into exile, magnificent in his defiance. "Lord have mercy," Martha breathed. "He's even more impressive than I remembered." Jake stepped down from the store's porch, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The spurs chimed softly with each step, a musical counterpoint to the growing noise of the crowd. As he walked toward the makeshift arena they'd roped off in the street, conversations died and heads turned. Some faces showed amusement, others concern, but all held curiosity about what this small man thought he could accomplish where larger, stronger men had failed. Ethan Cross pushed away from his perch against the saloon and intercepted Jake's path. Up close, the man's size was even more intimidating. Well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked capable of snapping a man's neck. His smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Wheeler," Cross said, his voice carrying the authority of money and influence. "Hope you're not planning anything foolish. That animal's dangerous, and I'd hate to see you get hurt over some misguided notion of proving yourself." Jake stopped and looked up at Cross with steady patience. Despite the height difference, there was no deference in his posture, no acknowledgement of intimidation. "Appreciate your concern, Mr. Cross, but I reckon I can handle myself." "Can you?" Cross's smile grew sharper. "Because from where I stand, this looks like a man who's bitten off more than he can chew. Thunder's already thrown the best riders. In 3 counties, what makes you think someone of your—" he paused meaningfully, "stature has any chance at all?" The insult hung in the air between them, and Jake felt the familiar weight of being measured and found wanting. But instead of anger, he felt only the calm certainty that had been building in him for months. He'd studied Thunder from every angle, watched how the horse moved, how he reacted to different people and situations. He'd seen something in the stallion that others missed, an intelligence and sensitivity hidden beneath the fury. "Maybe that's exactly what makes the difference," Jake replied evenly. "Maybe Thunder's tired of being approached like an enemy that needs conquering." Cross's expression darkened. "You sound mighty confident for a man about to make a fool of himself, and you sound mighty worried for a man who claims it can't be done." The words were spoken quietly, without heat, but they carried enough edge to draw murmurs from the crowd that had gathered around them. Cross's face flushed red above, his expensive shirt collar, and for a moment Jake thought the bigger man might throw a punch. Instead, Cross stepped back and gestured toward the corral with exaggerated courtesy. "By all means, Wheeler, show us what little Jake can do." Jake nodded politely and continued toward Thunder, leaving Cross seething behind him. As he walked, he became aware of Martha following at a respectful distance, along with Dr. Hayes, who apparently anticipated the need for medical attention. The crowd formed a loose circle around the rope barrier, their voices rising with excitement and speculation. But Jake's attention had narrowed to focus solely on the magnificent creature before him. Thunder stood in the center of the roped area, his 3 handlers keeping their distance but maintaining tension on the lead ropes. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished metal in the morning sun, and every line of his body spoke of power, barely restrained. As Jake approached the rope barrier, Thunder's head snapped in his direction. For a moment, man and horse regarded each other across the dusty ground. Jake felt the now familiar stirring in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than words or logic. In Thunder's wild eyes, he saw something that spoke to his own soul, the fury of being constantly underestimated, the pain of being judged by appearances, the longing to prove that size and strength weren't the only measures of worth. Jake ducked under the rope and stepped into the arena, his father's spurs singing their soft song with each step. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even Thunder seemed to pause, his ears pricked forward with sudden attention, as if he too recognized that this small man approaching him might be different from all the others. Jake moved with deliberate calm across the dusty arena, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd's murmurs died to whispers, then to complete silence, as if the entire town held its breath. Thunder watched his approach with ears pricked forward, his massive head held high, muscles rippling beneath his storm-dark coat. The 3 men holding the lead ropes exchanged nervous glances. Bill Turner, the head wrangler Cross had hired, was a seasoned cowboy who'd broken more horses than most men had ridden. Even he looked uncertain as Jake drew nearer to the magnificent stallion. "Easy now, Wheeler," Turner called out, his voice tight with tension. "Don't make any sudden moves. This one's got a temper like a rattlesnake." Jake acknowledged the warning with a slight nod, but didn't alter his pace. 20 feet from Thunder, he stopped and simply stood, his hands relaxed, at his sides. The stallion's dark eyes studied him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For a long moment, neither moved. Then something extraordinary happened. Thunder took a single step forward. The movement sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. In 3 months of captivity, the stallion had never voluntarily approached a human being. He'd fought, struck, and reared, but never shown curiosity about his captors. Jake remained perfectly still as Thunder stretched his magnificent neck toward him, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The horse's movements were cautious but deliberate, like a wild creature approaching a water source while watching for predators. "I'll be damned," someone whispered from the crowd. Turner's grip tightened on his rope. "Jake, be careful. He might be setting you up to strike." But Jake saw something different in Thunder's posture. The stallion's ears were forward, not pinned, back in aggression. His tail switched with nervous energy rather than angry lashing. Most telling of all, his weight was balanced on all four legs instead of cocked back on his haunches in preparation for an attack. "Easy, boy," Jake said softly, his voice carrying no more volume than a gentle breeze. "I know what it's like to be judged before folks get to know you." Thunder's ears flickered at the sound of Jake's voice, and he took another cautious step forward. The lead ropes grew taut as the handlers instinctively pulled back, but Thunder's attention remained fixed on the small man before him. Jake slowly raised his right hand, palm open, and extended it toward Thunder. The gesture was patient, non-threatening, an invitation rather than a demand. Thunder's nostrils flared again as he caught Jake's scent, processing information that only he could understand. The stallion's head lowered slightly, bringing his muzzle within inches of Jake's outstretched palm. Time seemed suspended as man and horse regarded each other, two souls recognizing something familiar in the depths of the other's eyes. Then Thunder's soft muzzle brushed against Jake's palm. The crowd erupted in gasps and excited whispers. Even Cross, who had been watching with skeptical amusement, straightened with surprise. No one had expected this. Every previous encounter with Thunder had resulted in violence or near violence. Yet here was Jake Wheeler, the smallest man in Cedar Ridge, sharing what appeared to be a moment of mutual recognition with the untamable stallion. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Martha breathed, her hand pressed to her heart. Jake remained motionless as Thunder explored his palm with curious lips, the horse's whiskers tickling his skin. The stallion's touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he recognized something precious and fragile that required careful handling. "That's it, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely audible. "We understand each other, don't we? Both of us know what it's like when folks think they've got you figured out before they've even tried to know you." Thunder's response was immediate and startling. The great horse stepped closer, bringing his massive head down to rest against Jake's chest. The gesture was so trusting, so intimate, that several people in the crowd gasped aloud. This wasn't submission. It was acceptance, freely. "Given," Turner's eyes widened. "In 30 years of handling horses, I've never seen anything like it." But the moment of connection was shattered by a harsh laugh from the crowd. Ethan Cross pushed forward, his face dark with anger and embarrassment. "Pretty. Touching display," Cross called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But touching doesn't break a horse. Let's see what happens when you try to actually ride him." The words struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Everyone understood. The implication, this peaceful moment was meaningless unless Jake could actually mount and ride Thunder. And riding him meant using the methods that had failed so spectacularly for every other man who'd tried. Jake looked up at Cross, his hand still resting gently on Thunder's neck. "Who said anything about breaking?" "What?" Cross's eyebrows rose. In mock confusion. "You planning to have tea parties with him? A horse is either broke or he's useless, and useless horses end up as dog food." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake felt Thunder tense beneath his touch, as if the stallion understood the malice in Cross's words. The horse's head came up, ears swiveling toward the crowd with renewed wariness. "There's more than one way to work with a horse," Jake said, quietly. "My father taught me that breaking and training aren't the same thing." Cross's smile was cruel. "Your father's not here to help you now, is he? And unless you can ride that animal, he's going back to my ranch, where we'll handle him properly." "Your ranch?" Jake's voice remained calm, but something had changed in his eyes. "I've got a purchase agreement with the territorial government. Thunder belongs to me as soon as I pay the fee." And I will pay it, just as soon as I figure out how. To break his spirit properly, the words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known Thunder was in temporary custody, but he'd assumed the magnificent horse would eventually be released back to the wild. The thought of this proud creature being subjected to brutal breaking methods, or worse, being destroyed if those methods failed, filled him with cold rage. Thunder seemed to sense Jake's change in mood. The stallion's head came up, his eyes fixing on Cross with unmistakable hostility. For the first time since Jake had entered the arena, Thunder looked truly dangerous. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, his hand moving to Thunder's neck in a soothing gesture. But his eyes remained locked on Cross. "What exactly do you mean by properly?" Cross's smile widened. "Whatever it takes. Some horses need stronger medicine than others, and if he can't be broken, well, there are other uses for a horse that size." The implication was clear, and Jake felt his father's silver spurs dig deeper into his heels as his muscles tensed. The crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere, conversations dying as people recognized they were witnessing something more significant than a simple horse-breaking demonstration. "You're talking about killing him," Jake said, his voice still quiet, but carrying a new edge. "I'm talking about being practical. A horse that can't be ridden is just expensive feed. Better to cut your losses and make what profit you can." Thunder snorted and took a step backward, his movements suddenly agitated. The stallion's eyes rolled white at the edges, and his breathing quickened. It was as if he understood every word being spoken about his fate. Jake placed both hands on Thunder's neck, feeling the great horse's accelerated heartbeat beneath his palms. "How long do I have?" "What?" Cross seemed genuinely confused by the question. "How long before you pay the fee and take him?" Cross glanced around the crowd, clearly enjoying his moment of power. "End of the week, 5 days from now. And if I can prove he can be worked with, properly trained without breaking his spirit." Cross laughed, the sound harsh in the morning air. "Wheeler, you can barely reach his back without a ladder. You think you can ride him?" "I'm asking about an agreement," Jake replied steadily. "If I can prove Thunder can be trained, really trained, not just broken, will you withdraw your purchase offer?" The crowd stirred with interest. This was unexpected, Jake Wheeler challenging Ethan Cross to what amounted to a public wager. Cross's expression shifted from amusement to calculation as he realized the trap being laid for him. "And if you can't?" Cross asked. Jake's jaw tightened. "Then he's yours to do with as you see fit." "Jake, no," Martha called from the crowd, but her voice was lost in the sudden buzz of conversation as people realized what they were witnessing. Cross studied Jake with new interest. This wasn't the meek acceptance he'd expected from the town's smallest resident. There was steel in Jake Wheeler's voice, a determination that spoke of hidden depths. 5 days, Cross said finally. "But we're not talking about party tricks. I want to see you mount him, ride him, control him, prove he can be worked like any other horse." "Agreed," Jake said without hesitation. Cross's smile returned, sharper than before. "Then we have a deal, Wheeler. 5 days to prove the impossible. When you fail, and you will fail, Thunder becomes mine, and everyone in this town will finally see you for what you really are. A small man with big dreams and no way to back them up." The words were calculated to wound, but Jake's expression remained unchanged. His hands continued their soothing motion along Thunder's neck, and the stallion gradually calmed under his touch. "We'll see," Jake said quietly, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Thunder lowered his great head until his forehead touched Jake's shoulder. The gesture was unmistakably protective, and several people in the crowd murmured their amazement. Cross's face darkened at the display of trust between man and horse. Without another word, he turned and stalked back toward the saloon, leaving Jake alone in the arena with Thunder and the weight of an impossible promise. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave the unprecedented scene they'd witnessed. Jake remained in the arena with Thunder, his hands moving in gentle patterns along the stallion's neck and shoulders. The horse stood quietly now, his earlier agitation fading under Jake's calming touch. Martha approached the rope barrier, her face creased with worry. "Jake, what have you gotten yourself into?" "Something that needed doing," Jake replied without taking his eyes off Thunder. "This horse doesn't deserve what Cross has planned for him. But 5 days? Jake, be realistic. No one's even been able to get a saddle on him." Jake finally looked up at her, his expression serious but not discouraged. "Martha, what do you see when you look at Thunder?" She studied the magnificent stallion, taking in his powerful build, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he stood with regal bearing despite his circumstances. "I see a beautiful horse, and a dangerous one. I see a horse that's been treated like an enemy instead of a partner." Jake's voice carried quiet conviction. "Every man who's tried to work with him has approached him like he's something to be conquered. But Thunder's not a mountain to be climbed. He's a thinking, feeling creature who's lost his freedom and doesn't understand why." Thunder's ears flickered at the sound of his name, and his muzzle brushed against Jake's shoulder in what seemed like agreement. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stepped forward, her medical bag clutched in one hand. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen enough of life's harsher realities to strip away illusions. "Jake, I admire what you're trying to do," she said, her voice kind but firm. "But I've patched up 3 men who tangled with that horse. 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion that kept Pete Morrison unconscious for 6 hours. Are you prepared for that kind of risk?" Jake's hand stilled on Thunder's neck as he considered her words. The stallion turned his head to study the doctor, and she instinctively took a half-step backward despite her professional composure. "Dr. Hayes, in your medical practice, do you approach every patient the same way?" The question surprised her. "Of course not. Different conditions require different treatments. Then you understand that different horses might require different approaches too." She nodded slowly, beginning to see his point. "Thunder's not vicious," Jake continued. "He's scared and angry and confused. Those other men got hurt because they tried to force him into submission instead of earning his trust." Bill Turner, who'd been coiling the lead ropes, paused in his work. "Jake, I've been handling horses for 30 years. Trust is a luxury you can't afford with an animal that outweighs you by 1,000 pounds. Sometimes you have to establish dominance first." "And how's that working out so far?" Jake asked mildly. Turner's weathered face reddened slightly, but he had to acknowledge the point. Every traditional method had failed spectacularly with Thunder. Jake turned back to the stallion, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest. "What do you think, boy? Want to show these folks that there might be another way?" Thunder's response was to lower his head and nuzzle Jake's chest, drawing gasps from the remaining onlookers. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that it seemed almost impossible coming from the same horse who'd terrorized every cowboy in 3 counties. "I'll need to work with him privately," Jake announced, his decision made. "Away from crowds and distractions, and I'll need materials to make proper equipment." "What kind of materials?" Martha asked. Jake's eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were remembering lessons learned long ago. "Soft rope. Maybe some leather if I can find it. Nothing harsh or punishing. And I'll need a quiet place where Thunder can feel safe while we work," Turner frowned. "The corral behind the saloon is the only place big enough, and it's hardly private. Half the town walks past there every day." "What about the old Patterson place?" Dr. Hayes suggested. "It's been empty since he died last spring, but the corral's still sound. It's a mile outside town, plenty private." Jake considered this. The Patterson homestead sat in a small valley surrounded by cottonwoods, isolated enough to keep curious onlookers at bay, but close enough for him to walk Thunder there and back each day. "That might work. Would need permission from whoever inherited the property." "That would be his nephew in Tucson," Martha said. "But I handle the mail correspondence. I could send a telegram explaining the situation. Assuming he agrees, how do we get Thunder out there?" Turner asked. "He's not exactly what you'd call manageable on a lead rope." Jake studied Thunder thoughtfully. The stallion had remained calm throughout their conversation, but Jake knew that moving him away from familiar surroundings could trigger panic or aggression. "We'll walk," Jake said simply. "Walk?" Turner's eyebrows rose. "Jake, it's a mile through. Rough country? What if he bolts? Then I'll follow him until he stops." Jake's voice carried quiet certainty. "But I don't think he will, not if he trusts me." As if responding to his words, Thunder stepped closer to Jake, his massive body creating a wall of warmth and muscle beside the small man. The display of trust was unmistakable, and several people shook their heads in wonder. Over the next hour, Jake worked with Thunder in full view of the gradually thinning crowd. He made no attempt to mount the horse or even place any equipment on him. Instead, he simply moved around the stallion, touching different parts of his body, speaking in low, soothing tones, allowing Thunder to investigate him in return. The horse's curiosity was evident as he explored Jake's clothing, his hat, even the silver spurs that chimed softly with each movement. When Thunder's nose found the leather pouch where Jake carried his few possessions, the stallion snorted with interest. Jake opened the pouch and withdrew a braided rawhide rope, no thicker than his thumb and soft as silk from years of careful oiling. It was a piece of his father's equipment, crafted with the skill of a master horseman and imbued with memories of gentler methods from a different time. Thunder investigated the rope with obvious curiosity, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of well-maintained leather and the faint traces of other horses who'd worn it years before. When Jake draped it loosely over Thunder's neck, the stallion tensed for a moment, then relaxed as he realized it carried no threat. "That's not a normal lead rope," Turner observed. "It's not meant to control him," Jake explained. "It's meant to connect us. There's a difference." By mid-afternoon, Jake had managed to fashion a simple halter from his father's rope, working slowly and patiently while Thunder watched every movement. The stallion allowed the halter to be fitted over his head without resistance, though Jake took care to make the fit loose and comfortable. When Jake finally led Thunder out of the arena, the stallion followed with surprising docility, his head held high but his movements relaxed. The few remaining townspeople watched in amazement as the small man and the magnificent horse walked side by side down the main street of Cedar Ridge. But Jake was acutely aware that the easy part was over. He had 4 days left to prove that. Thunder could be more than just a gentle companion. He had to demonstrate that the stallion could be ridden, controlled, and worked like any ranch horse. And he had to do it all while preserving the trust that had taken him one day to build. As they walked toward the Patterson homestead, Thunder's hoofbeats keeping time with Jake's steady pace, Jake reflected on the magnitude of the challenge he'd accepted. But when he looked up at the stallion's proud profile, he felt not fear but determination. Thunder deserved better than what fate had planned for him, and Jake was prepared to risk everything to ensure he got it. The Patterson homestead sat in a natural bowl carved between gentle hills, sheltered by ancient cottonwoods, whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. Jake had spent the morning preparing the space, clearing debris from the corral and checking every board for soundness. Thunder stood in the center of the enclosure now, his magnificent head raised as he surveyed his new surroundings. The privacy was exactly what Jake needed. Away from curious eyes and the pressure of public expectation, he could work at Thunder's pace rather than the town's. The stallion had made the mile-long walk without incident, following Jake with an easy trust that had surprised them both. "What do you think, boy?" Jake asked, running his hands along Thunder's neck. "Better than that cramped space behind the saloon?" Thunder's response was to lower his head and explore Jake's shirt pocket, clearly hoping for a treat. Jake smiled and produced a small apple he'd saved from breakfast, watching as the stallion's gentle lips took the offering with careful precision. The next few hours passed in patient groundwork. Jake moved around Thunder systematically, touching every part of the horse's body until the stallion accepted his presence without tension. He lifted each hoof, examined Thunder's teeth, ran his hands over areas where a saddle and bridle would eventually rest. The stallion submitted to each inspection with growing trust. Though Jake noticed, he remained alert to every sound from the surrounding hills. "You're listening for something, aren't you?" Jake observed, noting how Thunder's ears constantly swiveled toward the distant peaks. "What are you hoping to hear?" As if in answer, a faint sound drifted across the valley, the high, wild cry of horses running free. Thunder's head snapped up, his entire body rigid with attention. The sound came again, closer now, and Thunder responded with a trumpet call that echoed off the hillsides. Jake felt his chest tighten as he watched the stallion's transformation. This wasn't just any captive horse. Thunder was the leader of a wild herd, and somewhere in those hills, his family was calling for him. "They're your people," Jake said softly. "That's why you've been so angry. They took you away from everything you knew." Thunder's dark eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that seemed almost human. For a moment, Jake felt the full weight of what he was asking, that this magnificent creature abandon his freedom to serve human purposes. The moral complexity of the situation struck him like a physical blow. But then he remembered Cross's threats, the casual way the man had spoken of destroying Thunder if he couldn't be broken. In this world, there were only two options for a wild stallion: learn to work with humans or die. Jake's way might rob Thunder of his wildness, but it would preserve his life and dignity. "I know what I'm asking of you," Jake whispered, his hand resting on Thunder's powerful shoulder. "And I know it's not fair, but sometimes we have to choose between the life we want and the life that lets us survive." Thunder stood quietly, as if weighing Jake's words. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered his great head until his forehead touched Jake's chest. The gesture carried such profound trust that Jake felt tears prick his eyes. The afternoon brought new challenges. Jake introduced Thunder to the training rope he'd crafted from soft cotton, weaving it with techniques his father had taught him decades ago. The rope was designed to communicate rather than control, to suggest rather than demand. Working with infinite patience, Jake began teaching Thunder to respond to gentle pressure. A light touch on the halter to turn left, a soft pull to back up, the slightest shift in Jake's body position to indicate direction. The stallion's intelligence was remarkable. He seemed to understand each lesson almost before Jake finished teaching it. But progress was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jake looked up to see 3 riders cresting the hill, above the homestead. Even at a distance, he recognized Ethan Cross's imposing figure, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. Thunder sensed the intrusion immediately, his head coming up with nostrils flared. The stallion moved protectively closer to Jake, placing his body between the small man and the approaching riders. Cross dismounted outside the corral, his expensive spurs chiming as he walked to the fence. His 2 companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually on their gun belts, a not-so-subtle reminder of the power dynamics at play. "Afternoon, Wheeler," Cross said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Heard you'd moved our mutual friend out here. Thought I'd check on your progress." "Our agreement was for 5 days," Jake replied evenly. "It's been less than 2, true enough. But I'm a businessman, and I like to keep track of my investments." Cross's eyes fixed on Thunder, who stood tensely beside Jake. "Horse looks calm enough, I'll grant you that. But calm and rideable are 2 different things." As if to prove the point, one of Cross's men shifted in his saddle, and Thunder immediately stepped between him and Jake, his ears pinned back in warning. The stallion's message was clear: these men were not welcome. "Interesting," Cross observed. "He's protective of you. That's not necessarily a good thing in a working horse, Wheeler. A ranch horse needs to accept any rider, not just his favorite." Jake's jaw tightened. Cross was right, and they both knew it. A horse that bonded too closely to one person could become dangerous around others. "We're working on that," Jake said. "Are you?" Cross's smile was thin. "Because what I see is a horse that's learned to tolerate you, nothing more. Can you mount him? Can you control him at a gallop? Can you work cattle with him?" Each question hit like a physical blow, because Jake didn't have answers for any of them. He'd made remarkable progress in building trust with Thunder, but none of that mattered if he couldn't demonstrate practical horsemanship skills. 3 more days, Jake said firmly. Cross nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. 3 more days to prove the impossible. I hope you're not setting yourself up for disappointment, Wheeler. Because when this is over and Thunder still can't be ridden, everyone in Cedar Ridge is going to remember that little Jake thought he could do what real cowboys couldn't. The insult stung, but Jake forced himself to remain calm, rising to crosses. A bait would only prove the man's point about his limitations. We'll see, Jake said. Cross lingered for another few minutes, making observations about Thunder's conformation and discussing the horse's value with his men as if Jake weren't present. It was a calculated humiliation, designed to remind Jake of his place in the social hierarchy. When the 3 men finally rode away, Thunder remained tense for long minutes afterward. Jake worked patiently to restore the stallion's calm, speaking in low, soothing tones while his hands moved in the familiar patterns that had become their shared language. I know, Jake murmured. They make you uncomfortable too. But we can't let them distract us from what we're trying to accomplish. As evening approached, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. He removed Thunder's halter entirely. The stallion stood free in the corral, nothing preventing him from jumping the fence and running back to his wild herd in the hills. For a moment, Jake's heart hammered as he wondered if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. But Thunder simply turned and walked to where Jake stood, lowering his head to be scratched behind the ears. "Thank you," Jake whispered, overwhelmed by the trust implicit in the gesture. As the sun set behind the cottonwoods, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake sat on the corral fence while Thunder grazed peacefully nearby. The stallion could have left at any moment, but he chose to stay. The bond between them was real and growing stronger, but Jake knew that emotional connection alone wouldn't satisfy Cross or the watching town. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Jake would have to find a way to transform trust into partnership, partnership into practical skills. The clock was ticking, and with each passing hour, the stakes grew higher for both man and horse. In the distance, the wild horses called again, their voices carrying across the valley like a song of freedom. Thunder raised his head to listen, his body taut with longing, but he didn't move toward the sound. Instead, he returned to Jake's side, as if acknowledging that his fate was now bound to the small man who'd shown him kindness in a world that offered mostly cruelty. Jake looked up at the emerging stars and made a silent promise to Thunder and to himself. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would prove that gentleness could accomplish what force could not. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The third morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds building over the mountains that promised an afternoon storm. Jake arrived at the Patterson homestead to find Thunder standing at the far end of the corral, his attention focused on something beyond the fence. As Jake approached, he saw what had captured the stallion's interest: fresh hoofprints in the soft earth outside the enclosure. The wild herd had come close during the night, perhaps drawn by Thunder's calls. Jake could imagine the magnificent stallion standing at the fence, separated from his family by nothing more than wooden rails he could easily clear. Yet he had chosen to stay. "They came looking for you," Jake said softly as Thunder approached him. "Your family's still out there, still hoping you'll come home." Thunder's dark eyes held a melancholy that seemed almost human. The stallion allowed Jake to run gentle hands over his neck and shoulders, but there was a tension in his muscles that hadn't been there the day before. Jake understood. The longer Thunder remained in captivity, the more his wild herd would move on without him. Soon they would give him up for lost and disappear into the vast wilderness beyond the territorial borders. The stallion was facing a choice that would determine the rest of his life. Working with quiet determination, Jake began the day's training by introducing Thunder to the feeling of weight on his back. Using a heavy blanket, he slowly accustomed the stallion to the sensation of carrying something, watching carefully for signs of panic or rebellion. Thunder accepted the blanket with remarkable composure, though Jake could feel the horse's muscles trembling with the effort of controlling his instincts. Every wild horse's first response to weight on their back was to buck and fight. It meant a predator had landed on them, and survival depended on throwing off the threat. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his hands never stopping their soothing motion. "I know every instinct you have is screaming at you to fight this, but I need you to trust me." For 2 hours, Jake worked with infinite patience, adding small amounts of weight until Thunder could carry the equivalent of a rider without distress. The stallion's intelligence continued to amaze him. Thunder seemed to understand that this was preparation for something larger, and he submitted to each new challenge with growing confidence. But their progress was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Dr. Eleanor Hayes appeared at the corral fence, her medical bag in one hand and a worried expression on her weathered face. "Morning, Jake," she called. "Mind if I watch for a bit?" Jake nodded his permission, curious about what had brought the doctor out to the isolated homestead. Eleanor was not a woman given to casual visits or idle curiosity. "Heard some interesting conversation in town yesterday," she said as she climbed up to sit on the fence rail. "Folks are starting to take sides about what you're doing out here." "What kind of sides?" Eleanor watched as Thunder investigated her medical bag with cautious interest. "There's a group that thinks you're performing some kind of miracle. Martha's leading that camp, along with Bill Turner and a few of the older residents who remember when horse training was more art than force." Jake continued his work, but he was listening intently. "Then there's Cross's supporters," Eleanor continued. "They're convinced you're wasting everyone's time with what they call soft methods. They think Thunder's just playing along until he gets a chance to hurt someone." "And what do you think, Dr. Hayes?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying the interaction between man and horse. "I think you're both braver and more foolish than anyone realizes. What you're attempting, building this kind of partnership with a wild stallion, it's either going to be beautiful or tragic. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground." Jake paused in his work, Thunder's blanket half adjusted on the stallion's back. "You didn't come all the way out here just to tell me about town gossip?" Eleanor's expression grew serious. "No, I didn't. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll trust me enough to answer honestly." "What is it?" "Where did you really learn to work with horses like this?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake's hands stilled on Thunder's neck, and the stallion sensed the change in his mood, turning his head to study Jake with concerned eyes. "What makes you think I learned it anywhere special?" "Because what you're doing isn't common knowledge. The techniques, the patience, the way you read Thunder's body language, that's not something you pick up working odd jobs around town. That's education, Jake. Expensive education." Jake met her eyes steadily but said nothing. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I've been a doctor for 25 years, and I've learned to spot things that don't quite add up. Your hands, they're calloused from hard work, but there are old scars that look like rope burns. Professional rope burns, the kind that come from years of handling difficult horses. Your posture when you work, you move like someone who learned these skills as a child, not an adult." Thunder stepped closer to Jake, as if sensing his human's discomfort. "And those spurs," Eleanor continued gently. "They're not cowboy gear, Jake. They're Mexican, probably Spanish silver, worth more money than most folks in Cedar Ridge see in a year. They're the kind of thing that gets passed down through generations of horsemen." Jake's jaw tightened, but he still didn't speak. "I'm not trying to pry into things that aren't my business," Eleanor said. "But if you're going to succeed with Thunder, people need to trust you. And trust is harder to build when folks sense you're hiding something important." For a long moment, the only sounds were Thunder's gentle breathing and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Then Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father was a horse trainer in California, worked for some of the biggest ranches in the state, gentling horses that other men said couldn't be saved." Eleanor nodded encouragingly. His name was Eduardo Wheeler. People called him El Susurrador, the horse whisperer. He could take a horse that had been ruined by rough treatment and make it trust humans again. Taught me everything I know about reading horses, understanding what they need, what happened to him. Jake's hands resumed their motion along Thunder's neck, but Eleanor could see the pain in his eyes. He trusted the wrong man. Took a contract to train horses for a ranch owner who turned out to be using the operation as a front for other business. When my father discovered what was really going on, he tried to leave. They wouldn't let him. They killed him. The words. It came out flat, matter of fact, but Eleanor could hear the old grief beneath them. Made it look like an accident. Said he was thrown from a horse he was training. But I knew better. Papa never got thrown. Never. Thunder turned his head to nuzzle Jake's chest as if offering comfort. How old were you? 23. Old enough to know I needed to disappear before they decided I knew too much too. Jake's voice grew bitter. So I ran, changed my name, drifted from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. Ended. Up here 15 years ago, figured it was far enough from California that I could finally stop running. Eleanor absorbed this revelation in silence. It explained so much. Jake's reluctance to draw attention to himself, his careful privacy, the way he'd lived on the margins of Cedar Ridge society despite his obvious skills and character. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked gently. Jake looked up at her, his eyes reflecting old pain, but also a new determination. "Because Thunder deserves better than a coward for a trainer. And maybe it's time I stopped running from who I used to be." As if in response to his words, Thunder pressed closer to Jake's side, offering his silent support. The stallion seemed to understand that something important had just happened, that the man he'd chosen to trust had revealed a piece of his hidden soul. Eleanor climbed down from the fence and approached them both. "Jake, I want you to know, whatever happened in your past, the man you've become is someone this town respects and values. Don't let old fears make you forget that." Jake nodded gratefully, but his expression remained troubled. Time was running out, and he still hadn't proven that Thunder could be ridden. The weight of expectation, the pressure of his bargain with Cross, and now the burden of his revealed past. It all pressed down on his shoulders like a physical load. Thunder, sensing his distress, began the grooming behavior Jake had observed among the wild herds. The great stallion gently lipped at Jake's hair and shirt, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. "We understand each other, don't we, boy?" Jake whispered. "Both of us carrying secrets, both of us trying to be more than what the world expects." In the distance, thunder rumbled. Not from the stallion, but from the approaching storm. The afternoon would bring rain and wind, but Jake knew he couldn't afford to waste any more time. Tomorrow was his 4th day, and he still faced the ultimate test, proving that love and trust could accomplish what force and fear could not. The storm arrived with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain hammered the roof of the old Patterson barn, where Jake had taken shelter with thunder, and lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying displays. The stallion stood calmly, despite the chaos outside, his trust in Jake now so complete that even the storm couldn't shake it. Jake sat on a hay bale, working oil into the leather of an old saddle he'd retrieved from his room above the livery stable. That morning, the saddle was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, its leather aged to a rich mahogany brown, its silver conchos darkened with time, but still showing the intricate patterns of master metalwork. It had been his father's, one of the few possessions Jake had managed to save before fleeing California. Thunder investigated the saddle with curiosity rather than fear, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scents embedded in the old leather. Horses. From decades past, the oils and care that had kept it supple, and underneath it all, the faint trace of Eduardo Wheeler's hands. "Papa would have liked you," Jake told Thunder as he worked. "He always said the best horses were the ones with fire in their hearts. Said breaking that fire was like destroying a work of art." The stallion's ears flickered forward at the sound of Jake's voice, and he moved closer to investigate the saddle. more thoroughly. His lips explored the leather, testing its texture and scent with the same careful attention he'd shown Jake on their first meeting. Outside, the wind howled through the cottonwoods, but inside the barn, man and horse existed, in a bubble of calm trust. Jake had spent the morning working with Thunder on mounting exercises, first placing his hands on the stallion's back, then his arms, then carefully lifting himself up to lie across Thunder's back while the horse stood still. Each step had been a victory, but Jake knew that lying across Thunder's back was vastly different from sitting upright in a saddle and asking the horse to move. The real test was still ahead of them. "Tomorrow's our 4th day," Jake said quietly. "Cross will expect a full demonstration the day after that. Are you ready for this, boy?" Thunder's response was to rest his great head on Jake's shoulder, a gesture of trust so complete that it made Jake's throat tighten with emotion. The stallion had given him everything, his attention, his cooperation, his faith, and now Jake had to prove worthy of those gifts. The barn door creaked open, and Martha Hendricks peered inside, shaking rain from her shawl. "Jake, are you in?" "Here. Over here, Martha." She picked her way carefully through the cluttered barn, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Thunder standing peacefully beside Jake, the magnificent saddle gleaming in the lamplight. "My word," she breathed, "I've never seen him so calm. And that saddle, Jake, it's beautiful. Where did you get such a thing?" Jake's hands stilled on the leather. "It was my father's." Martha moved closer, her experienced eye taking in the quality of the craftsmanship. "Your father had expensive tastes. This is the kind of saddle you'd see on a wealthy rancher, not a drifter." "My father wasn't always a drifter," Jake said quietly. Understanding flickered in Martha's eyes. She'd suspected for years that Jake's story held more than he'd revealed, and this glimpse into his past confirmed her intuitions. "I came to warn you," she said, settling onto another hay bale. "Cross was in town this afternoon talking to anyone who'd listen. He's building sentiment against you, Jake, claiming you're wasting everyone's time with what he calls circus tricks." Jake looked up from his work. "What kind of sentiment?" "He's got people convinced that Thunder's just playing along, that he'll turn vicious the moment you actually try to ride him. Says when that happens, you'll get hurt, and the town will be responsible for letting you try." "Such a foolish stunt." Thunder shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in Jake's voice. "There's more," Martha continued reluctantly. "He's also spreading the story that you've been lying about your background. Claims no drifter could know as much about horses as you do. Implies you're some kind of confidence man, trying to pull a fast one on honest folks." Jake's jaw tightened. "And people believe him?" "Some do. Fear makes people want simple answers, and Cross is offering them one. That you're either a fool or a fraud, and either way, Thunder belongs with him." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. By revealing his past to Dr. Hayes, he'd hoped to build trust, but Cross was using that very revelation to undermine his credibility. In Cross's version of events, Jake's expertise became evidence of deception rather than qualification. "What about the others? The people who've been supporting me?" Martha's expression brightened slightly. "They're still with you, Jake. Bill Turner's been telling everyone who'll listen that what you've accomplished is nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Hayes has been vouching for your character, and I've been reminding people that actions speak louder than words. You've lived in this town for 15 years without causing anyone trouble, and that ought to count for something." Thunder moved to Jake's other side, creating a protective barrier between him and the barn door. The stallion's behavior reminded Jake that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. He had allies, both human and equine. "There's something else you need to know," Martha said hesitantly. "Cross has started talking about what he'll do with Thunder after he proves you can't ride him." Jake's hands stilled completely on the saddle. "What do you mean?" "He's suggesting Thunder might be too dangerous to keep alive. Says a horse that can't be broken is a liability that could hurt innocent people." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known Cross was ruthless, But the casual way the man spoke of destroying Thunder revealed a callousness that shocked even Jake's cynical expectations. Thunder sensed Jake's distress and pressed closer, his warm breath stirring Jake's. Hair as the great horse offered what comfort he could. "We won't let that happen," Jake said firmly. "Whatever it takes, however much it costs me, we won't let that happen." Martha reached out and placed her weathered hand on Jake's arm. "Jake, I've watched you these past 15 years, seen the kind of man you are. Whatever mistakes you think you made in your past, they don't define you now. This town is lucky to have you, and Thunder's lucky too." Her words carried the weight of decades of friendship and observation, and Jake felt some of his anxiety ease. Martha had known him longer than anyone in Cedar Ridge, and if she still believed in him, perhaps he could find the courage to believe in himself. The storm began to subside as evening approached, the thunder rolling away toward the eastern peaks. Jake finished his work on the saddle and carefully placed it on a saddle stand his father had crafted years ago. Tomorrow would bring the most crucial day of training, the final preparation before Cross's deadline. Thunder investigated the positioned saddle with renewed interest, as if understanding its significance. The stallion's acceptance of the equipment was complete. He showed no fear of the leather and silver that would soon rest on his back. "One more day," Jake whispered, his hand resting on Thunder's powerful neck. "One more day to prove that trust can accomplish what force cannot." As if in response, Thunder lowered his magnificent head and touched his forehead to Jake's chest, sealing their partnership with a gesture of complete faith. Outside, the first stars appeared through the breaking clouds, and Jake felt a cautious hope stirring in his chest. They'd come so far, overcome so much, that perhaps, just perhaps, they could complete the impossible journey they'd begun together. But even as hope grew, Jake knew that the hardest test still lay ahead. Tomorrow would determine not just Thunder's fate, but the truth of everything Jake believed about the power of gentleness in a world that too often chose force over understanding. The stallion remained close as Jake prepared to leave for the night, reluctant to let his human partner go. The bond between them had grown so strong that separation felt unnatural to both of them. "I'll be back at sunrise," Jake promised, "and tomorrow we'll show everyone what we've learned together." Thunder whickered softly in response, a sound full of trust and determination. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as partners, proving that size mattered less than heart, and that courage could take many forms, even that of a small man and a wild stallion who'd found understanding in each other's eyes. Jake arrived at the Patterson homestead before dawn, his father's saddle across his shoulders and determination coursing through his veins. This was the day he would attempt the full mounting and riding demonstration that would prove Thunder could be worked with rather than broken. Thunder greeted him with a soft whicker, pressing his great head against Jake's chest in their familiar morning ritual. The stallion seemed to sense the importance of the day, his movements alert but calm as Jake began their routine. Working with infinite care, Jake placed the saddle pad on Thunder's back, watching for any sign of tension or resistance. The stallion accepted it with remarkable composure, though Jake could feel the slight trembling in Thunder's muscles that spoke of controlled instincts. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured. "Today's the day we show them what we can do together." The saddle went on next, its familiar weight settling onto Thunder's back like it belonged there. Jake took his time with the cinch, tightening it gradually while Thunder stood with remarkable patience. The stallion's acceptance was so complete that Jake felt his confidence growing. He was reaching for the bridle when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders moving fast across the valley floor. Jake's first thought was that Cross had come early to witness the training, but as the riders crested the hill, his blood turned to ice. 3 men sat their horses at the edge of the homestead, their silhouettes stark against the morning sky. Jake recognized none of them, but something about their bearing, their watchful stillness, sent alarm bells clanging in his mind. These weren't local ranchers or curious townspeople. These were men with a purpose. Thunder sensed Jake's sudden tension, his ears swiveling forward as he studied the strangers. The stallion moved protectively closer to Jake, placing his body between his human and the potential threat. The lead rider spurred his horse forward, stopping just outside the corral fence. He was a lean man with hard eyes and silver-streaked hair, his clothes expensive but practical. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Jake recognized with growing dread. "Jacobo Herrera, or should I call you Jake Wheeler now?" Jake's world tilted on its axis. No one had called him by his real name in 15 years. The carefully constructed life he'd built in Cedar Ridge suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Jake said steadily, but his hand moved instinctively to Thunder's neck, drawing comfort from the stallion's solid presence. The man laughed. "Oh, I don't think so. You look just like your father, boy. Eduardo was a good friend of mine, before he got too curious about things that weren't his business." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. This was Vicente Morales, the man whose operation had cost Eduardo Wheeler his life. The man Jake had spent 15 years hiding from, believing he was safe in the remote territories of Arizona. "Don Vicente," Jake said quietly, "it's been a long time." "Indeed it has. You led us quite a chase, disappearing the way you did. Cost me a lot of time and money to track you down." Morales dismounted and approached the fence with casual confidence. "But I'm a patient man, and I don't like loose ends." Thunder stepped forward, positioning himself between Jake and Morales with unmistakable intent. The stallion's ears were pinned back, his nostrils flared with aggression that Jake had never seen directed at him. "Magnificent animal," Morales observed, apparently untroubled by Thunder's hostility. "I heard you were trying to break him. Interesting that Eduardo's son would choose such a public display of his talents." "What do you want, Vicente?" "What I've always wanted. To tie up loose ends." Morales's expression hardened. "Your father saw things he shouldn't have seen, learned things that could have caused me considerable trouble. I had to deal with him, of course, but I always wondered how much he might have told his son." Jake felt the old fear rising in his throat, but it was tempered now by something else. Anger. 15 years of running, 15 years of living in shadows, all because this man had murdered his father to protect his criminal empire. "He told me nothing," Jake said. "I was just a horse trainer, nothing more." "Perhaps, but you disappeared very suddenly after Eduardo's accident. That suggested guilt, or at least knowledge. I couldn't take the risk of letting you live with whatever secrets you might carry." One of Morales's companions, a thick-set man with cruel eyes, spat into the dust. "Vicente, why are we wasting time talking? Let's finish this and get out of here." Morales held up a restraining hand. "Patience, Carlos. I want to understand something first." He turned back to Jake. "Tell me, Jacobo, how does a man spend 15 years hiding from his past, only to put on a public display that draws attention from hundreds of miles around?" Jake's blood chilled. Morales was right. His challenge with Thunder had been anything but subtle. Word of the unusual horse training demonstration had spread beyond Cedar Ridge, drawing curiosity and attention from across the territory. "The horse needed help," Jake said simply. "The horse." Morales studied Thunder with new interest. "Yes, I heard about your wager with Ethan Cross. Quite a public spectacle you've arranged." Something in the way he said Cross's name made Jake's stomach drop. "You know Cross?" Morales smiled. "Know him? Jacobo? Cross works for me. Has for years. Who do you think told me where to find you?" The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Cross's determination to claim Thunder, his cruel taunts, his systematic undermining of Jake's credibility, it had all been part of a larger plan to flush Jake out of hiding. The wager was a trap, Jake said, understanding flooding through him. Very effective one. Cross told me about the small man who knew too much about horses, who had expensive equipment and skills that didn't match his story. It took some investigation, but we eventually identified you from descriptions. You really shouldn't have worn your father's spurs, Jacobo. They're quite distinctive. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, his agitation growing as he sensed Jake's distress. The stallion's protective instincts were fully aroused now, and Jake could feel the great horse gathering himself for action. "So now what?" Jake asked. "You kill me like you killed my father?" "Eventually. But first I want to see this demonstration everyone's been talking about. Cross tells me you've accomplished something remarkable with this stallion. I'm curious to see if Eduardo's training methods produced results worth all the trouble you've caused me." The casual cruelty of it, demanding a performance before an execution, revealed the depths of Morales's sadistic nature. But Jake also sensed an opportunity. The man's arrogance might be his weakness, and if I refuse... Morales gestured toward the hills surrounding the homestead. "I have men positioned at every exit from this valley. Your little demonstration has drawn quite a crowd already. I can see riders approaching from town. It would be unfortunate if innocent people got caught in crossfire because you chose to be uncooperative." Jake followed Morales's gaze and saw dust clouds rising from multiple directions. Word of today's training session had indeed spread, and people were coming to witness whether Jake could fulfill his impossible promise. Thunder pressed against Jake's side, offering what comfort and strength he could. The stallion seemed to understand that they were facing their greatest challenge yet, not just proving that trust could triumph over force, but doing so under the shadow of mortal danger. "You want a demonstration," Jake said quietly. "Then you'll get one. But I warn you, Vicente, Thunder and I have an understanding. If you threaten him, or anyone else here today, you'll discover that some wild things can't be caged or controlled." Morales laughed, but there was uneasiness in the sound. Something in Jake's voice, or perhaps in Thunder's increasingly aggressive posture, had penetrated his confidence. "We'll see, Jacobo. Mount your horse and show me what Eduardo's son learned before he dies." Jake looked into Thunder's dark eyes and saw his own determination reflected there. They'd come too far, overcome too much, to let fear defeat them now. Whatever Morales had planned, whatever Cross had orchestrated, Jake and Thunder would face it together. The approaching riders were closer now, their dust clouds clearly visible against the morning sky. Among them, Jake thought he could make out familiar shapes: Martha's buggy, Dr. Hayes's steady mare, perhaps even some of Cross's men coming to witness what they expected would be Jake's humiliation and Thunder's destruction. Instead, they would witness something else entirely. The final proof that courage came in many forms, and that even in the face of death, some bonds could not be broken. Jake reached for Thunder's bridle with steady hands, his father's spurs chiming softly as he moved. Whatever happened next, he would meet it as Eduardo Wheeler's son, not as Jake Wheeler, the man who'd spent 15 years running from shadows, but as Jacobo Herrera, heir to a tradition of horsemanship that valued partnership over domination. Thunder lowered his great head to accept the bridle, sealing their partnership in the face of overwhelming odds. Jake's hands moved with deliberate precision as he adjusted Thunder's bridle, the silver bit gleaming in the morning light. It was another piece of his father's equipment, crafted by a master silversmith in Mexico, designed for communication rather than control. The bit was gentle, curved to rest comfortably in a horse's mouth, etched with intricate patterns that told the story of generations of horsemen who valued partnership over domination. Thunder accepted the bridle without resistance, his dark eyes fixed on Jake's face, as if drawing strength from his human's calm demeanor. But Jake could feel the stallion's tension. Thunder sensed the danger surrounding them as clearly as Jake did. "Remember what Papa taught us," Jake whispered, his voice so low that only Thunder could hear. "A horse and rider become one mind, one heart. Whatever happens, we trust each other." Morales watched from outside the corral, his patience wearing thin. "Enough preparation, Jacobo. My time is valuable." But Jake continued his methodical routine, checking every strap, every buckle, ensuring that his father's equipment was properly fitted. These might be his final moments with Thunder, and he wanted them to be perfect, a tribute to Eduardo Wheeler's memory and a demonstration of everything the old horseman had taught his son. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Jake could see the first riders cresting the hills now. Martha's familiar buggy, followed by Bill Turner on his steady gelding, Dr. Hayes on her dependable mare. Behind them came others, shopkeepers, ranchers, families with children who'd heard stories of the small man and his magnificent stallion. "Quite an audience you've arranged," Morales observed. "Cross told me the whole town was invested in this little drama." As if summoned by his name, Ethan Cross appeared at the top of the eastern ridge, accompanied by a dozen of his men. Even at a distance, Jake could see the satisfied smile on Cross's face. The man had orchestrated this entire situation, using Thunder as bait to flush Jake from hiding after 15 years. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, his agitation growing as more strangers surrounded their sanctuary. The stallion's wild instincts screamed at him to run, to flee this gathering of potential threats, but his loyalty to Jake held him in place. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his hands never stopping their soothing motion along Thunder's neck. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but we're not running anymore." The admission surprised Jake with its clarity. For 15 years, fear had been his constant companion. Fear of discovery, fear of Morales' vengeance, fear of bringing danger to innocent people. But standing here with Thunder, preparing for what might be their final ride together, Jake felt that fear transforming into something else. Fierce determination to protect what he'd come to love. Martha's buggy was the first to reach the homestead, and Jake saw her face go pale as she took in the scene. Morales and his men positioned around the corral like predators waiting to strike. Cross's riders spreading out across the hills, the tension that crackled through the air like electricity. Before a storm, Dr. Hayes arrived next, her experienced eyes immediately cataloguing the threats surrounding Jake and Thunder. She dismounted and approached Martha's buggy, the two women exchanging worried glances. "This doesn't look like a simple horse training demonstration," Dr. Hayes observed quietly. Martha's voice was tight with concern. "No, it doesn't. Who are those men with Jake?" Before anyone could answer, Cross spurred his horse down the hill, his riders following in formation. The man's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the sneering bully who'd tormented Jake with cruel words. In his place was something far more dangerous, a predator moving in for the kill. Cross dismounted near Morales, and the two men exchanged nods of recognition. The gesture confirmed Jake's worst fears. This had all been planned, orchestrated, to draw him into the open where Morales could finish what he'd started 15 years ago. "Gentlemen, ladies," Cross called out to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the false bonhomie of a politician. "Welcome to what promises to be a memorable demonstration. Jake Wheeler has made some remarkable claims about his abilities with horses, and today we'll finally see if he can back them up." More riders arrived, families who'd come to watch what they thought would be a simple exhibition of horsemanship, unaware that they were witnesses to a deadly trap 15 years in the making. Jake's heart clenched as he saw children among the spectators, innocent faces bright with excitement at the prospect of watching the small man ride the legendary stallion. Thunder pressed closer to Jake, the great horse's instincts screaming warnings about the danger surrounding them. But the stallion's loyalty held him steady, his trust in Jake stronger than his fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cross continued, his voice rising to carry across the gathering, "before we begin, I think you should know a few things about the man you've come to support. Jake Wheeler isn't who he's pretended to be all these years." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martha started forward, but Dr. Hayes caught her arm, both women sensing that interruption might make things worse. "His real name is Jacobo Herrera," Cross announced, "and he's a wanted fugitive from California. He's been living among you under false pretenses for 15 years, hiding from the law." The accusation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Jake saw shock and confusion on familiar faces, people who'd known him, trusted him, accepted him as one of their own, despite his quiet ways and mysterious past. "That's not true," Martha called out, her voice strong despite her obvious distress. "Jake Wheeler is a good man. He's lived here peacefully for 15 years, helped anyone who needed it, never caused a moment's trouble." "Has he?" Cross's smile was cruel. "Or has he been waiting for the right moment to disappear again, taking whatever he could steal with him?" The lie was smoothly delivered, designed to plant seeds of doubt in minds already shaken by the revelation of Jake's false identity. Jake saw uncertainty flickering in eyes that had previously held only kindness and acceptance. Bill Turner pushed forward on his horse, his weathered face set in lines of stubborn loyalty. "I don't care what his name is or where he came from. Jake Wheeler, or whatever he wants to call himself, is the finest man I've known in 40 years of living, and what he's done with that horse is nothing short of miraculous." "Miraculous?" Cross laughed. "Or just an elaborate confidence game? How do we know he hasn't been drugging the animal, making it docile with chemicals?" The suggestion was absurd, but Jake saw it take hold in some faces. Fear and confusion made people susceptible to the worst interpretations, and Cross was a master at exploiting those weaknesses. Morales stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of money and power. "I'm Vicente Morales, and I've come a long way to settle accounts with this man. Jacobo Herrera is wanted in connection with the death of his father, Eduardo Wheeler, a crime that went unsolved because the suspect disappeared." The words were carefully chosen, technically true, but misleading in their implications. Eduardo had indeed died, and Jake had indeed disappeared, but Morales had been the murderer, not Jake. Yet to the crowd, it sounded like an admission of guilt. Jake felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on his shoulders, 15 years of hiding, of living under a false name, of careful isolation designed to protect himself and others. Now that protection had become a weapon turned against him, every precaution he'd taken twisted into evidence of guilt. Thunder sensed his distress and turned to nuzzle Jake's chest, offering what comfort he could. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that several people in the crowd murmured with surprise. Whatever Jake might have done in his past, his relationship with the stallion spoke of patience and kindness, not violence and deception. "Enough talk," Morales said finally. "I came here to see a demonstration, and I believe these good people deserve to see whether their faith in this man is justified. Mount your horse, Jacobo, and show us what you can do." Jake looked around the circle of faces, some hostile, some confused, some still showing traces of the friendship and respect he'd earned over 15 years of quiet service to the community. Martha's eyes held tears of worry, but also unwavering loyalty. Dr. Hayes watched him with professional assessment, clearly trying to evaluate the medical risks of what he was about to attempt. Bill Turner nodded encouragingly, his faith unshaken by revelations or accusations. And Thunder stood beside him like a mountain of strength and trust, ready to carry him through whatever trials lay ahead. Jake placed his foot in the stirrup, his father's spurs chiming softly as he prepared to mount. The sound seemed to awaken something in Thunder. The stallion's head came up, his ears pricked forward with sudden alertness, as if he recognized the significance of the moment. "This is for you, Papa," Jake whispered, so quietly that only Thunder could hear, "and for everyone who believes that gentleness can be stronger than force." He swung up into the saddle with fluid grace, and Thunder stood perfectly still beneath him. No bucking, no rearing, no attempt to throw off the weight on his back. The stallion had accepted Jake completely, horse and rider united in purpose and trust. A gasp went up from the crowd. Even Cross looked surprised at the ease with which Jake had mounted the supposedly unrideable stallion. Morales's eyes narrowed with something that might have been respect or might have been calculation. Jake settled into the saddle, feeling Thunder's power beneath him like contained lightning. The stallion's muscles rippled with barely restrained energy, but his movements were controlled, responsive to Jake's lightest touch. Impressive, Morales admitted, but can you actually ride him or just sit on him like a decoration? Jake looked down at his father's silver spurs, at the worn leather reins in his hands, at Thunder's ears pricked forward with eager attention. Everything his father had taught him, every lesson about trust and partnership and the sacred bond between horse and rider, had led to this moment. "Hold on, boy," Jake whispered to Thunder. "It's time to show them what we can do together." Jake pressed his legs gently against Thunder's sides, and the stallion responded instantly, moving forward with smooth, collected strides. The crowd fell, silent as they witnessed something none of them had expected. Perfect harmony between horse and rider, as if they were a single entity, rather than two separate beings. Thunder's movement was poetry in motion, his powerful muscles flowing beneath Jake's seat with liquid grace. The stallion held his head high, arched neck showing off his magnificent bearing, but his ears remained constantly focused on Jake, waiting for the slightest signal. Jake guided Thunder through a series of basic maneuvers: walk, halt, turn left, turn right. Each command was given so subtly that most observers couldn't detect the signals, yet Thunder responded immediately and precisely. It was the kind of seamless communication that took years to develop between horse and rider, achieved in mere days through trust rather than force. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill Turner breathed, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "I've been working horses for 40 years and I've never seen anything like it." Even Cross's expression showed grudging amazement, though his eyes remained hard with calculation. This wasn't the spectacle of failure he'd expected. Jake was demonstrating a level of horsemanship that made Cross's rough methods look crude. By comparison, Jake felt Thunder's confidence growing beneath him, as the stallion realized he could perform these tasks without pain or punishment. The horse began to show off slightly, adding flourishes to his movements that spoke of intelligence and pride rather than mere obedience. "Trot," Jake whispered, barely above a breath, and Thunder smoothly shifted gaits. The stallion's trot was magnificent, elevated, balanced, each step covering ground with effortless power. Jake sat deep in the saddle, moving with Thunder's rhythm as if he'd been born to it. His father's silver spurs never touched Thunder's sides. They were there purely for tradition, their music adding elegance to each movement. Martha clasped her, hands together, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, "it's beautiful." Dr. Hayes watched with professional fascination, noting how Jake's entire body language spoke of confidence and control without tension. This wasn't a man fighting to stay on a barely controllable animal. This was a master horseman demonstrating his art with a willing partner. But Jake was acutely aware that the true test was yet to come. Morales hadn't traveled hundreds of miles to watch a simple riding demonstration. The man wanted more. He wanted to see Jake pushed to his limits, wanted to find flaws that would justify whatever violence he'd planned. "Very pretty," Morales called out, his voice carrying clearly across the corral. "But any broken horse can walk and trot on command. Let's see what happens when you ask for something more demanding." Jake felt Thunder's muscles tense slightly. At the harsh tone in Morales's voice, the stallion's ears flicked back momentarily, registering the threat implicit in the man's words. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his hands steady on the reins. "Don't let him get to you." Jake guided Thunder into a canter, and the stallion's response was immediate and willing. The three-beat gait was smooth as silk, Thunder's powerful hindquarters, driving forward with controlled energy, while his front end remained light and elevated. They circled the corral in perfect balance, horse and rider moving as one entity. The crowd watched in awed silence, witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about horse training. This wasn't domination. This was partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, but Jake noticed something troubling in the crowd's positioning. Gross's men had spread out around the perimeter, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Morales's riders had also shifted position, creating what looked suspiciously like a closing net. Thunder sensed the subtle menace too. The stallion's ears began swiveling constantly, tracking the movement of potential threats while maintaining his smooth gait. His nostrils flared as he tested the air for signs of danger. "Enough games!" Morales called out suddenly. "I want to see this horse really tested. Carlos!" The thick-set man Jake had noticed earlier spurred his horse forward, producing a coiled rope from his saddle. "Let's see how well-trained your stallion is when he's faced with real cowboy work." Without warning, Carlos swung the rope over his head and sent the loop flying toward Thunder. It was meant to settle around the stallion's neck like a lasso, simulating the kind of rough treatment Thunder might face on a working ranch. But Thunder's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The stallion reared straight up, his front hooves pawing the air as he screamed his fury at the perceived attack. In that moment, all his wild instincts reasserted themselves. This was exactly the kind of aggressive handling that had made him unbreakable in the first place. Jake stayed with him through the rear, his legs clamped tight, his hands soft on the reins to avoid jerking Thunder's mouth. As the stallion's front hooves crashed back to earth, Jake was already speaking to him in low, urgent tones. "Easy, Thunder, easy, boy. They can't hurt you while I'm here." But the damage was done. The crowd gasped and scattered backward, reminded suddenly that beneath Thunder's gentle demeanor was still a wild stallion with the power to kill. Several women screamed, and Cross's voice rose above the chaos. "There, you see what happens when you try to pretty up a savage animal. Wheeler can't control him when he's really challenged." Jake felt Thunder trembling beneath him, the stallion's muscles coiled for flight or fight. One wrong move, one moment of panic from either of them, and someone could be seriously hurt. The very violence Jake had worked so hard to avoid was being forced upon them by Morales's calculated cruelty. "Throw another rope," Morales commanded. "Let's see what happens when he's really pressured." "No!" Jake's voice cracked like a whip across the corral. For the first time since mounting Thunder, he showed real anger. "This proves nothing except that he responds to threats the way any intelligent creature would." But Carlos was already swinging another rope, and Jake realized this was exactly what Morales had planned, to create chaos, to make Thunder look dangerous, to justify whatever violence would follow. The demonstration had been a trap from the beginning, designed not to showcase Jake's abilities, but to create grounds for destroying both horse and rider. Thunder's ears pinned flat against his skull as he saw the second rope coming, and Jake felt the stallion gathering himself for another explosive reaction. In seconds, the controlled demonstration would dissolve into pandemonium, giving Morales all the excuse he needed to claim that Thunder was too dangerous to live, and Jake too reckless to deserve mercy. As the second rope snaked through the air toward Thunder, Jake made a split-second decision that would have seemed impossible moments before. Instead of trying to control Thunder's wild reaction, he channeled it. "Now, Thunder!" Jake shouted, and pressed his legs hard against the stallion's sides. Thunder exploded forward, not in panic, but in controlled power. Jake had read his partner's intentions perfectly and guided that raw energy into purposeful action. The stallion charged directly at Carlos, his hooves thundering against the packed earth, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. Carlos's horse shied violently at Thunder's charge, and the rope went wide, missing its target completely. The man fought to control his mount, terror replacing arrogance, as he found himself facing a stallion who was no longer victim but aggressor. But Jake wasn't finished. With subtle pressure from his legs and a slight shift of weight, he guided Thunder into a series of maneuvers that demonstrated the true depth of their partnership. Thunder spun, pivoted, and danced with the precision of a trained cutting horse, his movements so fluid and controlled that it was clear every step was deliberate. "Sweet Mary," Dr. Hayes breathed. "He's not just riding him, He's working with him. The crowd watched in stunned amazement as Jake and Thunder moved together like a single entity. The stallion's wild energy transformed into controlled grace. This wasn't the rough domination typical of broken horses. This was artistry, the kind of horsemanship that elevated the partnership between human and animal to something approaching the sacred. Cross's face had gone pale with realization. His carefully orchestrated demonstration was backfiring spectacularly, showing Jake to be not a fraud, but a master horseman whose abilities made Cross's own methods look crude and primitive. "Enough!" Morales barked, his hand moving to his gun. "This changes nothing, Jacobo. Pretty tricks won't save you from what you owe." But Jake had positioned Thunder perfectly, the stallion's body creating a barrier between them and Morales while keeping the crowd at their backs. It was a tactical position that would have done a cavalry officer proud. "What I owe?" Jake's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet corral. "The only debt here is yours, Vicente. You murdered my father in cold blood, and you spent 15 years hunting me to cover up your crimes." The words hit the crowd like thunder. Martha gasped. Dr. Hayes's eyes widened with understanding, and Bill Turner's weathered face darkened with anger as he realized what they'd been witnessing. "That's quite an accusation," Morales said smoothly, but his hand remained near his weapon. "Do you have any proof of these wild claims?" "I have something better than proof," Jake replied. "I have witnesses." From the hill behind Morales came the sound of approaching horses, but these weren't more of Cross's men. These were United States Marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun as they rode down into the valley. Morales spun around, his face going white as he recognized the danger. But it was too late. The marshals had him surrounded, their own weapons drawn and ready. "Vicente Morales," the lead marshal called out, "you're under arrest for the murder of Eduardo Wheeler and conspiracy to commit murder." Jake felt thunder relax beneath him as the immediate threat dissolved. The stallion's breathing slowed, his muscles losing their battle-ready tension as he sensed that the danger had passed. "How?" Cross demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. Martha stood up in her buggy, her face bright with fierce satisfaction. "Because Jake told Dr. Hayes the truth about his past, and Dr. Hayes contacted the territorial authorities. Did you really think a murder 15 years old wouldn't still have people working to solve it?" Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. "Eduardo Wheeler was well known in California horse circles. When he was killed, several people suspected foul play, but they needed someone who could identify the real culprits. Jake's testimony, combined with evidence the marshals have been gathering, was enough for arrest warrants." Cross looked around desperately, realizing that his careful plan had collapsed completely. His association with Morales, his role in luring Jake into the open, it all made him a co-conspirator in attempted murder. "I want a lawyer," Cross said quickly. "You'll get one," the marshal replied, "right after we sort out your part in all this." As Morales and Cross were placed in custody, Thunder turned his great head to nuzzle Jake's leg. The gesture was gentle, protective, as if the stallion understood that they'd survived their greatest trial together. Jake dismounted slowly, his legs slightly unsteady after the intense confrontation. Thunder immediately moved to his side, pressing close as if to offer physical support. The crowd began to surge forward, voices raised in excitement and congratulation, but Thunder positioned himself between Jake and the well-wishers, the stallions. Message was clear. His human needed space and quiet after the ordeal they'd shared. "It's all right, boy," Jake said softly, his hand resting on Thunder's powerful neck. "They're friends now." Martha was the first to reach them, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around Jake in a fierce hug. "Jake Wheeler, Jacobo Herrera, I don't care what your name is. You're family, and we don't abandon family." Dr. Hayes approached more slowly, her medical bag ready in case shock set in. But Jake's color was good, his breathing steady, and Thunder's calm presence seemed to be grounding him. "How long have you known?" Jake asked her. "I suspected for weeks." Your skills, your equipment, the way you talked about your father, it all suggested a deeper story. When you told me the truth, I contacted some colleagues in California who'd been tracking Morales' organization for years. Bill Turner pushed through the crowd, his face bright with admiration. Jake, what you did with Thunder, I've never seen anything like it. The way you two moved together, it was like watching magic. Jake looked up at Thunder, who stood quietly accepting the crowd's attention while remaining alert to his humans' needs. The stallion had proven something far more important than his trainability. He'd shown the power of trust, loyalty, and partnership in the face of overwhelming odds. Thunder did the real work, Jake said modestly. I just had to learn to listen to what he was trying to tell me. As the crowd began to disperse and the marshals led their prisoners away, Jake remained beside Thunder in the corral that had witnessed their triumph. The stallion lowered his magnificent head to rest against Jake's chest, and Jake felt the last of his 15-year burden of fear and hiding finally lift from his shoulders. They'd faced the worst together and emerged not just surviving, but transformed. A small man and a wild stallion who'd proven that courage, trust, and gentleness could overcome even the darkest threats. 3 months later, Jake, now proudly using his birth name of Jacobo Herrera, stood in the same corral, where he'd once faced Vicente Morales' deadly trap. But everything had changed. The morning sun cast golden light across a scene of peaceful industry as Thunder grazed contentedly nearby, his wild edges softened by partnership without losing any of his magnificent spirit. Jake held in his hands a leather nameplate he'd crafted himself, tooled with the intricate patterns his father had taught him decades ago. It read, "Thunder Partner Not Property," in elegant script, and would hang on the gate of the stallion's new home. The words represented more than mere sentiment. They embodied a philosophy that was transforming how horses were treated throughout the territory. Martha approached from the direction of town, her face bright with the satisfaction of a morning's successful business. At 72, she moved with the energy of someone who'd found new purpose in life. Since Jake's vindication and Morales' imprisonment, she'd become his unofficial business manager, helping coordinate the flood of requests from horse owners. Seeking his unique training methods, 3 more letters came in this morning's mail, she announced, waving a bundle of correspondence. 2 from ranchers in New Mexico and 1 from as far away as Colorado. Word is spreading fast about what you accomplished with Thunder. Jake smiled, running his hand along the nameplate's smooth surface. What you mean is, word is spreading about what Thunder accomplished with me. He taught me that being small doesn't mean being weak, and that trust can accomplish more than force ever could. Thunder raised his magnificent head at the sound of his name, ears pricked forward with interest. The stallion wandered over to investigate the nameplate, his soft lips exploring the tooled leather with familiar curiosity. Dr. Hayes stopped by the store earlier, Martha continued. She wanted me to tell you that the Territorial Veterinary Association has officially endorsed your training methods. They're calling it the Cedar Ridge approach and want to sponsor demonstrations across the Southwest. Jake felt a flush of pride, not for himself, but for his father's memory. Eduardo Wheeler's gentle methods were finally gaining the recognition they deserved, validated not by academic theory, but by practical results that spoke louder than any textbook. And Bill Turner's been telling everyone who'll listen that you've revolutionized his understanding of horses, Martha added with a chuckle. Yesterday, I heard him explaining to a group of cowboys that partnership beats domination every time, using language that would have made Eduardo proud. The mention of his father's name no longer brought pain, but rather a warm sense of connection across the years. Jake had spent 15 years running from his heritage, but Thunder had taught him to embrace it instead. Thunder nuzzled Jake's shoulder, then turned his attention to something approaching from the eastern hills. Jake followed the stallion's gaze and smiled as he recognized the familiar sight of wild horses moving across the distant ridges. Thunder's old herd still ranged through the territory, and occasionally they passed near the Patterson homestead. Thunder always watched them with interest, but he no longer called to them with the desperate longing Jake remembered from their early days together. The stallion had made his choice, trading the freedom of the wild for the deeper satisfaction of partnership. "Sometimes I wonder if he misses it," Jake said quietly, watching Thunder's calm observation of his former family. "The wild life, the complete freedom." Martha followed his gaze to where the distant horses moved like shadows across the landscape. "I think he knows he's gained something more valuable than what he gave up." "Look at him, Jake. Really look at him." Jake studied Thunder's posture, his alert but relaxed bearing, the way he positioned himself protectively near Jake while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The stallion carried himself with dignity and purpose, no longer the angry, frightened creature who'd been dragged from his natural home. "He looks," Jake said slowly, "like a horse who knows his worth." "Exactly. And more than that, he looks like a horse who's found his calling." So many creatures, human or animal, can say they've discovered what they were truly meant to do. Thunder turned back to them, as if sensing the importance of their conversation. The stallion approached Jake with the calm confidence of an equal, lowering his head to be scratched behind the ears. Jake obliged, marveling again at the transformation they'd both undergone. Thunder had taught him that size and strength weren't the only measures of worth, while Jake had shown Thunder that humans could be partners rather than masters. "I've been thinking about expanding," Jake said, his voice thoughtful. "Not just training individual horses, but teaching other people these methods. Creating a school where horsemen can learn that partnership accomplishes more than domination." Martha's eyes lit up with excitement. The Patterson homestead would be perfect for that kind of operation. "It's isolated enough for serious work, but accessible enough for students to reach easily." Jake nodded, the vision taking shape in his mind. He could see it clearly, a place where horses and humans learned to communicate in the language his father had taught him, where trust replaced fear and understanding overcame force. "We'd need more land," he mused. "Facilities for students, housing for horses that need rehabilitation." "Cross's ranch is going up for auction next month," Martha said with a meaningful look. "The bank's seizing it to pay his legal debts. It adjoins the Patterson place and has all the facilities you'd need." The irony was perfect. Cross's attempt to destroy Jake had ultimately provided him with everything necessary to build something beautiful and lasting. The ranch that had once represented opposition to Jake's methods would become the foundation for spreading those methods throughout the West. Thunder stepped closer, pressing his warm shoulder against Jake's side, as if offering his approval of the plan. The stallion seemed to understand that their partnership was evolving, growing beyond just the two of them to encompass something larger and more meaningful. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake felt a deep sense of completion. For 15 years he'd lived in shadows, hiding from his past and denying his gifts. Thunder had taught him to step into the light, to embrace not just his skills, but his true identity. The wild horses disappeared over the ridge, heading toward whatever adventures awaited them in the vast wilderness. Thunder watched them go without sadness, content in the knowledge that he'd chosen a different path, one that led not away from human contact, but toward a deeper understanding of what partnership could accomplish. Jake hung the nameplate on. Thunder's Gate, the morning sun catching the silver letters and casting them in brilliant relief. The words seemed to glow with promise. Thunder, partner, not property. It was more than a name. It was a declaration of principles, a statement of belief in the power of trust over force, partnership over domination, understanding over fear. And as Thunder touched his soft muzzle to the leather in apparent approval, Jake knew that sometimes the smallest person truly could carry the biggest heart, especially when that heart was strengthened by the partnership of a magnificent stallion who'd chosen trust over freedom. In Cedar Ridge, folk still measured worth, but now they knew that the most important measurements had nothing to do with height.